thank you all for coming. One thing Christian omitted to mention when he mentioned all the labor and hard work that went into this is that an enormous amount of that hard work and labor was his. Christian tracked me down when I was just out of college in Beijing and told me that the archives were open and there were ways of getting there. He then put the considerable resources of the Wilson Center at my disposal as I tried to go about doing research there. And he's done that not just for me, but for countless other people, many of you in this room could name. So this really wouldn't have been possible without the resources of this place and without all you did. So thank you for that. In telling the story of where the book began, I try to explain what might be a weird quirk of personality. I've always been fascinated by borderlands. I've always been drawn to places that aren't quite one thing or another, but sort of fall in between. Places where people don't have a straight answer to the question, where are you from? Places where they clamor in several different languages as easily as we're talking today. Places where things are all mixed up and jumbled and together. And one of the fascinating parts of doing research in the newly opened archives of the Foreign Ministry of the PRC, and even more newly closed archives of the Foreign Ministry of the PRC, which is something we can talk about. But one of the fascinations of doing that was realizing that the PRC in Mao's time was every bit as fascinated with borderlands as I was, albeit for very different reasons. And it was a fascination that had been largely unremarked by historians of China's foreign affairs or by international historians of the Cold War. Cold War international historians do now say the Cold War went well beyond the US and the Soviet Union, but the role of what you might think of as the fourth world, non-state actors, people in these places in between, is something that's gone largely unremarked. But between 1959 and 1962, the fourth world, in the form of local crises in the Tibetan Borderlands, was absolutely crucial to the conduct of the People's Republic of China. And it was so in three ways. First of all, the crises that erupted over there showed that the Chinese state was weak, something neither the state had recognized nor would historians later. Second, in dealing with that weakness, China was forced to move from what you might think of as empire-light to a harder, heavier imperial structure. And thirdly, that shift from empire-like to harder, heavier imperial structure triggered a shift in China's foreign policy towards the third world, with ramifications that went well beyond Tibet. And we'll talk about each of these three things in the course of today's discussion, but before getting there, you need to know how and why Mao's China came to Tibet in the first place. Most people think of Tibet, think of this tiny, isolated place with lamas running around and that's it. It wasn't. You're talking about a huge place. It's 4 times the size of France, and it rolls out over this expanse of mountains and deserts and saline lakes and even forest. Very difficult geography there. It can take you days and days to get from one place to another. It's also an astonishingly cosmopolitan place at the time of our story. You'd have heard several different languages in the markets of Lhasa or Dhingra. There were people from Mongolia and Nepal and the Soviet Union and India and China all mixing, all of them just not answering that question I asked to begin with. Where are you from? And perhaps partly because of that particular geography, partly because of that cosmopolitanism, and there might be a bit of a chicken and egg thing going on here, Tibet seems to have been a place that was defined by statelessness. What do I mean by that? I don't mean to say Tibet was always a part of China, which is obviously untrue, but I also find it hard to think of Tibet as a country or a nation state. And in making that distinction, I was drawn to the infamous Henry Kissinger quip about Europe. Who do you call when you call Europe? Who do you call when you call Tibet was a very difficult question. Depending on what you wanted done, you would talk to the Dalai Lama's Council of Advisors, you would talk to the Panchen Lama, you would talk to a random guard on a border post. There were all sorts of different people conducting all sorts of different foreign policies. If unity of foreign policy is the aspect of a nation state that defines it, then Tibet certainly wasn't one. There was a certain amount of religious cohesion, there was a certain amount of social cohesion, but politically and diplomatically, Tibet looked more like a bunch of different entities than a single nation state. This fourth world area had a back and forth relationship with China. It was conquered by the Mongols and then again by the Qing dynasty. The relationship lapsed at various points too, and it waxed and waned, but by the time the Qing fell, so too did Chinese authority over Tibet was pretty much at an end at that point. It's not that New China at that point didn't claim Tibet or claim sovereignty over Tibet, it's just that for practical purposes, Tibet was going its own several different ways, and Chinese rule over Tibet didn't really exist. The beginning of the change in this comes with the emergence of the civil war between the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists. It's important in several respects, not least in that it marks Mao's first encounter with ethnic minorities, and lesson will stay with him for a long time, because he notices the tension between Han Chinese and Chinese minorities as he thinks of them. But the larger implications for Tibet are, instead of a China that's weak and turned in upon itself and tearing itself apart, you now have the chance of a single, unified, powerful state right on your frontier. And that's going to change the power relationship with China dramatically. The Chinese Civil War rages on, and it weaves its way into the Cold War. And this is something that those innocent Tibetans were well aware of. The Kashag, which was a council of ministers in Lhasa, when expelling Chinese in July 49, justified the decision on the basis of being good anti-communists. Quote, "Wherever there is Chinese government and forces, there rises communism and trouble. All the people of Tibet are worried that such bad system communism may come into being in Tibet, where there's the religion of Lord Buddha, which is source of happiness of all things." Now, you see what they're doing here. They're saying, we're on the side of the anti-communists. You British in India, we're going to be receiving these Chinese expellees, who seem to have been nothing more than traders, by the way, who just happened to have fallen afoul of local authorities. We're on the side of the anti-communists, so be nice to us. And that shows a certain amount of awareness of the broader international system that Tibetans weren't generally given credit for. There's nothing predetermined in the outcome of the Civil War. It takes a really long time to decide. But after many a twist and turn, Mao Zedong, in October 49, proclaims the People's Republic of China. Now, once you've proclaimed the People's Republic of China, you have to make a conscious decision to take Tibet. Large parts of the PRC, as we know it today, weren't a part of that state in 1949. It's all the more interesting because once upon a time, Mao had actually touted the idea of self-determination for ethnic groups. He had said that Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia might split off, might become parts of a federation, might be independent countries. That rhetoric got abandoned somewhere along the way, the reasons for which are still unclear. But by the time he comes to power, he's very much talking about taking Tibet. And there are reasons to take it. There's the geostrategic significance. You want to guard against a potential invasion from India. There's ideology. Ideology mattered. Liberating serfs is what good communists do, and Mao Zedong is a good communist. There's also an ideology of anti-imperialism at work here, which sounds kind of weird, but is really a key factor in the way the Chinese are thinking about this. The Chinese Communist Party was well aware that there were British special agents, Kuomintang special agents, and even some Americans messing around China's far west. These agents, they were very sure, and they genuinely believed this, were imperialists. And if there were imperialists in Tibet, then taking Tibet over and expelling these imperialists was an act of anti-imperialism, which is what Mao Zedong was all about, which is what New China was all about. So being anti-imperial, wanting to liberate these people from the oppressive ways of empire, is pushing Mao's China into taking Tibet, into doing something that looks very much like an imperial grab. It's anti-imperialism that's pushing them into forming an empire, but it's an empire nonetheless. And when I say it's an empire, I think back to the Qing dynasty, which historians now call an empire. And you're talking about something that looks roughly the same, the taking over of a large territory with different people and rule that's going to be imposed from a distant, different center. The interesting thing as the Chinese do this is how cautious they are about making sure that there's minimal local resistance, that the locals can get, that they can get collaboration on the ground. The directive to Chinese forces is be nice as you conquer. There are attempts at negotiation. And when the eventual agreement that gets Tibet to become part of China is signed, it's astonishing how much room for autonomy, genuine autonomy, it leaves. The idea is that China is going to control foreign policy and defense, but there's going to be no major reform, a la communism, as there will be in China proper. There's a recognition of the rights of the laity. And Tibet, for practical purposes, this is the agreement, can do pretty much what it wants. It looks like one country, two systems. I use that phrase deliberately because the man in charge of drafting the agreement, and this is where he comes up with this idea, and you can see him drawing on those lessons later in life. In retrospect, it looks like a bad idea, but at the time, what's astonishing is how well this works for a bit. The Dalai Lama is extremely enthused by this. He wishes to join the Communist Party at one point and is told by Mao, we don't think it's necessary. Tibet functions reasonably well during this time. And we'll get to why it doesn't in a bit. But for the early to mid-50s, this looks like a reasonable proposition. There are several implications for China for foreign policy. First of all, because Tibet's so cosmopolitan, you have to deal with neighbors. There's trade going on, there's pilgrimage going on, and someone has to figure out what this means in terms of foreign policy. And the famous agreement on trade with Tibet gives China its major precepts for how to deal with the world. You get a trade agreement with India, and whereas for most people a trade agreement is just a trade agreement, if you're as ambitious and grandiloquent as Mao Zedong and Jawaharlal Nehru, a trade agreement can be something much more. It can be the source for showing the world how foreign relations should be conducted. And they come up with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence as a preamble to the trade agreement in Tibet. Mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. Now, if that sounds completely banal, and the way states that are generally at peace relate with one another, that's kind of true. That said, the very banality of it might have been reassuring to the people who were signing the agreement. And in a way, it's the opposite of all that imperialism was, right? Imperialism wasn't predicated on mutual respect for sovereignty. Imperialism wasn't predicated on mutual non-aggression. This is a template for how non-imperial relations in the world can be conducted. This is how new China and newly decolonized India are going to do business. And they're going to show the world how countries should relate to one another. And to this day, the Chinese hold that this is our signal contribution to thought about international relations. And you can see how this whole idea emerges from a trade agreement, really. It's a preamble to a trade agreement, but it takes on a life of its own. And it becomes a mantra when you're talking about international relations at this time. The third world should be united. If countries like Pakistan and Thailand want to join anti-communist pacts, it's because they haven't understood and taken on board the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. If the Soviet Union later on is having a problem with Hungary or Poland, well, if only everybody would respect the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, everything would be okay. That's the power of ideas here, and they come from Tibet. The other question that emerges, of course, is borders. And I think it was in this room, actually, that Shen Zhenhua pointed out to me that the CCP was basically a gang of peasants who had come to power. When you're a gang of peasants who have just come to power, you have no way of knowing where your borders are. This is the pre-internet age. There are no existing documents because the nationalists have fled with all of those that will show you where your borders are. You have to figure out where your country ends and where someone else's territory begins, and it's not easy. And this comes up in discussions with India and with other countries, and the Chinese say, quite honestly, we need a little time to figure this out because we don't know where our borders are, so would you give us a little time? And they do what you only do if you're very serious in China. They set up a commission to investigate where the boundaries will be. The commission's an interesting thing, and what's interesting about it is how honest and open it is. It acknowledges that they don't know where the territory is, and that there's the need to negotiate on territory with neighbors, with India, with Nepal, with Pakistan. The commission doesn't insist on a specific line at most points. It doesn't say this is ours and has always been part of China. It says rather there's room for give and take here. And the general PRC policy towards borders at this point seems to have been, if you keep talking to people, if you keep negotiating with people, there is room to disagree. Sooner or later you'll come to an agreement. If you don't, it's just a line in the middle of territory. Much more important to preserve good relations with people than to actually agree upon the line. It's just a question of talking long enough. They figured this will work out. In some cases it did. And there was no reason in 1958 to assume that it would stop working. Empire light in the Himalayas meant that there wasn't a crisis that would make this untenable, and the PRC could afford an easy-going foreign policy. The problem comes in if there's a crisis and instability reigns in the borderlands, and the problem started really with maps. Chinese cartography of Tibet wasn't a strong point. That one country, two systems agreement applied to what you might think of as political Tibet, or as the Chinese called it at the time, the locality of Tibet. There were large chunks of the Tibetan plateau in places like Sichuan, Yunnan, and now defunct province called Xikang that were subject to reforms a la communism. And what this did was to create a stream of rebellions, notably by the Khambas, some of them supported by the CIA, which the Chinese sought to counter with a harsh counterinsurgency. The result was a stream of refugees pouring into Tibet proper, and into Lhasa especially. Food prices went up, always a bad sign when that happens. And strange whispers began to circulate. What were the Chinese doing? Was the Dalai Lama somehow duped into being trusting as he was? Was he going to be kidnapped by the communists? He was still, after all, little more than a boy, as the Tibetans saw it. And such a person, though godly, could be duped. A crowd gathered around his palace, the Norbalinka, and Chinese soldiers gathered too. And you have to remember, being a Chinese soldier in Tibet isn't easy. You have altitude sickness, which can be pretty severe. You don't really understand the language. You don't understand why people are being mean to you when you've come to liberate them. You're tired, you're young, you're far from home. Someone's nerves snapped, a shot was fired. The Dalai Lama heard the shot and he fled to India. It's unclear whether he got there because Mao was okay with letting him leave, which Mao later claimed, or because distraction tactics worked. The Tibetans sent out bands of horsemen along different paths to India so that no one would be sure which way the Dalai Lama was taking. And that's when the crises began. You have massive violence in Lhasa as PLA troops storm monasteries. You have bands of Tibetans ganging up in towns along the western borders, and floods of people trying to flee. There seems to have been the hope amongst the Chinese that the Dalai Lama would come back. People were actually allowed to march at the Barkhor, holding up banners demanding his return. But that didn't happen. And as this crisis erupts, the PRC finds it doesn't have the capacities to deal with it. It doesn't have the capacities to deal with the questions this crisis is posing. And it's in developing those capacities that it's going to make a change from empire-like to something a little harder. So let's see how, and let's shift scale a bit to New York. Once the crisis erupts, the United Nations is bubbling with excitement. It's easy to dismiss civil society, but civil society at the time, and now arguably, was something really strong. There was the Tibet Society from Britain, there were Americans concerned for Tibet, there were Kalmyks, Soviet refugees who happened to be practicing Tibetan Buddhists, who have settled in a long belt from New York to New Jersey. All these people were advocating for something to be done about this. Chiang Kai-shek, the defeated nationalist leader sitting in Taiwan, is saying to himself, I don't support independence for Tibet, but some sort of resolution that gets blue helmets there is a way to it's the first step to me taking back China. He never gave up on dreaming of taking back China, ever. There's the Tibetan movement. Gyalo Tondo, the Dalai Lama's brother, has been pushing for Tibetan statehood for a really long time. He's been doing this while the Dalai Lama has been collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party. Now's his moment. All these people get together and they manage to bring a resolution which says intervention against China for crimes against humanity in Tibet is justified. Nikita Khrushchev, sick and tired of being outswum by Mao Zedong, decides that he's going to let this happen. China's a dangerous enemy. So the resolution goes through, and all of a sudden you have a UN intervention on China's southwest frontier. And it looks like the PRC is on the ropes. That didn't happen. Every bit except the last bit where the resolution went through happened, but the resolution going through didn't happen, which was fortunate for the Chinese. But you have to remember how easily it could have happened. It was a possibility, and it was a possibility the Chinese official mind wrestled with constantly. And you have to remember that they had been in combat with UN forces during the Korean War, which does color their perceptions of what might be going on in the UN. Remember, too, that the PRC is excluded from the United Nations at this time. It doesn't have the capacity to defend claims in the international arena. And defending claims in the international arena after the UN's been formed means having a seat there, which the PRC doesn't. If the United Nations had intervened en masse, the whole situation confronting them would have looked completely different, and they knew it. And that's why they did certain things. The first move was a diplomatic shift, and that meant moving much closer to the Soviet Union than one might have liked. We keep talking about the Sino-Soviet split when we talk about Chinese foreign relations during the Cold War. It doesn't seem to have been a split so much as one of those bad relationships where people drift apart and then come together because there's nothing else to be done, and then they drift apart again. And in this case, there was something to be done, so they drifted together. The Soviets, as they knew, had a veto in the Security Council, and the Chinese started by getting the Panchen Lama, that other Lama, on their side. There's an awareness that the Panchen and Dalai Lamas have had a long conflict in Tibetan history. This is part of that fourth world different foreign policies agenda I was talking about. If you can bring someone like this to the Soviets and say, he's going to make a good impression, that might go a long way in getting the Soviets on your side. So on May Day, he's brought up a chat with Soviet and Eastern European diplomats in Beijing, and he makes a good impression. He says what the Chinese are doing is for communism, and it's very good, and it's good for Tibet, and we hope you'll come and visit when we're a glorious communist society. Whether it's that he made a good impression, whether it's the Kalmyks comparisons to Soviet conduct in 1956, or whether it's simply the idea that the UN shouldn't be in the business of intervening in things like this, the Soviets make it very clear that they're not going to support resolutions against the PRC. Massive step for China. It tells you something important about the split, that despite their differences, there is still room for cooperation on the world stage. The PRC also made sure that other countries saw where things stood. Pakistan is told in no uncertain terms that any resolution against China in the UN is going to be bad. Northern Europe, where the Dalai Lama's brother is just visiting as a private citizen to talk, the ambassadors are hauled in and told it is an unfriendly act to have him there talking. They explain that, well, he's just coming to talk, there's nothing official about it, he's just giving a few press conferences, we're not going to do anything at the UN. No, that's an unfriendly act. It's a shift in diplomatic tone that wasn't there before. They're helped unwittingly, but luckily for them, by the world they were operating in being one where other empires were still intact. Britain and France are very careful about what a resolution on Tibet should look like, because it would call into question their own empires. As one British diplomat put it, it would open the way to discussions about Oman, Nyasaland, Ulster. The French want nothing to do with it because of Algeria. They're looking at the PRC and they're seeing kin. The resolution dog is forcing them to see that kin. It's not kin you like, it's not exact kin, but it's close enough to make you extremely uncomfortable. And we tend to forget that empire was not just state on state, it's state on stateless too. But this fact that the British and the French could look at them and say, this makes us feel uncomfortable about our own possessions, should tell you something about how many different types of empire could exist and how they could recognize one another. It's also true that the PRC is now vociferous in proclaiming its rights in Tibet, which is a shift. You don't have to be vociferous about proclaiming your rights if your rights aren't being called into question. It's when a crisis happens that you have to become much more loud about it. And that's one measure of the transition from empire-light to empire-heavy. This works surprisingly smoothly, and you can spin several different stories about how wrong it could have gone. On the ground, however, things are a lot more complicated. So let's get back to the ground, and let's begin by looking at relations with Nepal. 1959 in these borderlands is a state of war, and a state of very messy war. And what makes the war an issue of foreign policy particularly is that there were many foreigners, including diplomats in Tibet, and that people could move back and forth across countries that hadn't been properly categorized yet. The Nepali consulate got shelled on March 20th. The Nepali consulate thought, well, it's probably PLA troops firing at us. They were told, no, it's the Tibetan rebels. They decided not to make a fuss about it, but you see how life was affected. And a lot of Nepalis who have been living there, trading there, doing business there, suddenly find that their life is threatened. People are fleeing, people aren't buying from them, people are stealing from them. And this is a particular problem for the PRC because when people feel their livelihood isn't secure, they're apt to join up with the side that's going to offer them security of livelihood. And if the Nepalis make the calculation that that's going to be Tibetan rebels, then there's a chance that the enemies that PRC is trying to combat are going to expand dramatically. There's always a risk that they would join the rebellion, and that's something that PRC has to work against. The other thing that happens, of course, is that Nepalis get swept up in the arrests against bandits and criminals. By 1960, there were reportedly more than 100 Nepalis who had been taken prisoner in counterinsurgency actions in Tibet. That number is a little weird because it sort of eludes the question of who was Nepali. You'll remember I said this was an extraordinarily cosmopolitan place. In an extraordinarily cosmopolitan place, you have countless examples of intermarriage. There are people who can claim descent from both Nepal and Tibet, and that's a huge problem for the Chinese. Take the case of a man named Changbal Wojo. He's 33, he's male. He is of mixed Nepali and Tibetan descent, or Hunchra as the Chinese call him. He had chosen Nepali citizenship, but he had also participated in a rebellion conference. He had trafficked guns back and forth across the Himalayas, and worst of all, he had cursed the party. Now, there had been an agreement in 1956 that said people could choose citizenship if they wanted to. But right till about now, no one's thought to enforce that agreement, because there's never been any reason to. Why would you bother to go to people who've been living there for as long as you can remember and say, now decide, are you Nepali or are you Tibetan, and therefore Chinese? There's been no reason to till now. But now it's important because you need to know who people are, you need to know what they're doing, you need to know why they're leaving, because they could be criminals fleeing. You need to know if they're really foreign and just claiming protection, or are they Tibetans? Are they going to join rebel groups in Nepal that are going to make mischief? All these distinctions have to be made, and the state starts forcing people to decide who they are. Now, forcing you to choose citizenship doesn't sound that bad, but if you think about it, it's the state intruding on your life in a fundamental way. It's the state saying, we have the right to tell you who you are, and we have the right to force you to exclude part of who you are from your future identity. It's a very intrusive process that went completely counter to the cosmopolitanism that had defined life in the Tibetan plateau. And this changed things dramatically for people who lived there. If there's a need to divide people, there's also a need to settle a line, to settle the border, because nobody knew where it was. So Zhou Enlai made a trip to Nepal in 1960, and it's a trip that goes extraordinarily well for him, but it's also a wonderful exemplar of the forces gathering against the PRC in a neighboring country. Zhou's goals were pretty simple for this trip. He wanted to improve relations and reassure Nepal about Tibet. He wants a pact to govern relations while a solution to the border question is pending. And he wants an agreement on dividing Everest. Everest, as you know, part of it belongs to China, part of it belongs to Nepal. This is where that gets settled. The trip is menaced by Ma Dengbiao and co. Ma Dengbiao is a weird character. The information is provided to Chinese diplomats in India from a source in the Nepali Communist Party. You can see how intelligence networks function here. Ma is a mysterious Tibetan who had links with the Kuomintang. He had helped support a revolutionary party in Tibet. He was linked with an Indian called Prasad, who was trying to bring the Dalai Lama, the Khambas, and the Kuomintang together. And in conjunction with a Taiwanese woman named Joshu and a Muslim Chinese named Ismail, he's putting together propaganda pamphlets denigrating the communes, thereby undermining PRC efforts in Tibet. Now, once the PRC gets this intelligence from its sources in the subcontinent, it does something very interesting. It shares the intelligence with Nepal, which is not something you do unless you're willing to place a certain amount of trust in people. We don't know how real the threat was, but the Nepalis later informed the PRC that there were indeed Tibetans colluding in this way, and that Nepali officialdom had foiled them. The results of Zhou's talks with Koirala were less pleasant. There was no final settlement of the Everest question. Koirala, after some grandstanding, said he needed time to carry domestic opinion with him. And Zhou Enlai was perfectly willing to accept this. The solution was there, but it takes some time, that's okay. They also reached an agreement to negotiate the border amicably, which was not easy. One provision in particular was supposed to help maintain that, and that was, look, there had been a massive troop buildup on both sides of the border because the PLA had sent troops to deal with Tibetans. The Nepalis, who aren't exactly trustful of large numbers of soldiers on the other side of the border, decide to build up their own troops. In a situation like this, things can go wrong, and the provision they reach is each side is going to maintain a distance of 20 kilometers from the disputed boundary. That way, nobody's going to shoot anyone, and everything's going to be okay. It's a marvelous agreement, and the Chinese are very proud that it's reached despite Indian pressure on Nepal not to reach such an agreement, and we'll talk about India in a bit. And the agreement goes wrong almost immediately. At some point in June 1960, somewhere in the Himalayas, we don't know where, PLA troops opened fire on a group of men. One died, others were seized, and their property was confiscated. It was a perfect counterinsurgency operation except for one thing. The attacked people were Nepalis, and it just might have happened on Nepali territory. Now, the interesting thing that happens from here is Zhou Enlai makes a point of acting on the information before Nepal brings the matter up. He lets the Nepalis know he's found out. There's disagreement over where the incident was. Nepal maintains that it's in Nepal. Zhou Enlai says no, it was north of the customary line, and the PLA soldiers pursuing Tibetan rebels had mistaken Nepali troops and attacked, that it wasn't our territory. Nevertheless, despite it being on Chinese territory, Zhou is willing to consider compensation, and indeed does offer compensation down the line. The likeliest explanation, to my mind, is that the troops just didn't know where the border was. They were pursuing rebels, and they blundered into Nepal and opened fire on the first bunch of armed men they saw, which seems to fit with what we know about this situation. Whatever the case, it did violate the 20-kilometer agreement. The Zhou claimed Nepal had been informed. Bottom line, Nepal gets some compensation, says, why don't you just let us know next time you're pursuing rebels, we could even help you out, just observe this 20-kilometer agreement. Problem solved, matter closed. It's a remarkable study in how crisis management can work. You can dial things down after you've shot at people, which isn't something we automatically think about. But, wrong it could have gone. Let's turn to that other Himalayan country, India. India poses many of the same problems Nepal did. There are people who can go back and forth. There are hunchers, people with mixed blood. There's a border that nobody really knows the specifics of, though this is slightly different because it involves the revision of one delineated by the British. Nepal was never part of the British Empire, so that wasn't a factor there. So same factors, you would hope they could be managed the same way, but it could and did go very differently. You're talking about, broadly speaking, two main disputed sectors, an eastern sector and a western sector. And Zhou Enlai in 1960 had proposed a swap. The swap was, we'll keep the western sector, Aksai and you take the eastern sector, India, and problem solved. This was rejected. In and of itself, the rejection wouldn't have been a problem. At a press conference afterwards, Zhou says, you know, it's just a rejection, it's temporary, we'll keep talking about it, and we'll figure something out. And that really does seem to have been the attitude that carried through in negotiations in 1961. Just disagreeing about the final delineation of a line wouldn't have been a problem. The problem was that India was pursuing what seemed to be a territorially aggressive agenda while using Fourth World movements in ways that jeopardized PRC national security. In other words, it's not the border we're worried about, it's the relationship. The Chinese get very early evidence of this from a kidnapped Tibetan nun who had been dragged to India by the Khambas and made her way back. And she gave evidence about how Indians were telling Tibetans that the rebellion would get help and that India would help out. And such activities didn't stop on the Indian side of the disputed border. Nomads. On November 27, 1961, nomads of Ladakhi origin entered grasslands, and the prefectural authorities in Ali over there told them that they needed to pay a tax. The nomads said, what tax? We have customary grazing rights on Indian territory, which if you're a Chinese official trying to demand the tax is extremely problematic, and you get very huffy and you say, no, this is Chinese territory, where do you think you are? Once the nomads were told this, they backed off, but the problem had been defined very clearly. Where once upon a time, nomads were simply nomads, just crossing back and forth. Now they could be, not were, but they could be agents of a hostile power trying to stake out claims to territory. They could be, as one report put it, clearly in the service of Indian reactionaries to conduct an armed provocation and invade our sovereign territory. Now, there are several problems with this. Nobody knows how many nomads there are. Nomads don't think in terms of boundaries in countries. They think in terms of grass. We'll go where the grass grows. We think in terms of bats. And nobody wants to interfere with these movements too much because the local fabric of life depends on them to a huge extent. The last thing you want by cracking down on such movements too hard is another rebellion or more enemies. There are two sides to any counterinsurgency, a hard side where you crush the implacable opposition, and a soft side where you try to quote-unquote win hearts and minds. And local authorities say, we need to pay attention to the soft side. We'll keep an eye out on them. We'll ask our own nomads to graze far from the disputed border so that there's no confusion. And we'll check people stringently, but we don't want to be too harsh on this. Even as they're saying that, though, the mere fact that they're checking stringently and dividing nomads by border shows you something lost. It shows you a rim getting harder and darker and less porous. Nomadic movements are causing the state to strengthen itself on the edges. There's also the question of hunters. The Indians seem to have been willing to use them against the PRC. Take the case of Hamid. Hamid's a Tibetan Muslim. He's of Kashmiri ancestry, which is interesting. He's born in Lhasa. He's made his way to and from India thrice between 1940 and 48. Most suspicious character, this Hamid. Somewhere in his travels, he met a British special agent, Reginald Fox. Now, the interesting thing about this is that by this time, Fox had long retired from Britain's Secret Service, and the Brits get tired of explaining to the Chinese that he's no longer the British special agent Fox, he's just Fox. But the Chinese keep insisting, no, he's Special Agent Fox, and that's the way it is. Anyway, Hamid learned to use a telegraph from Fox. He ran special operations in Chamdo between 1950 and 53. In 1959, he takes part in the rebellion, and most damning this is seen reporting to the Indian consulate in Lhasa. When he's eventually captured, they find a copy of his diary and a camera. The diary never surfaced. I don't know where that is. A rare bookmark in China someday might be a good place to hunt. The interesting question about Hamid is it's so difficult to figure out who he is. Is he British? Well, he's got those ties with the Brits, but India's no longer part of the British Empire. Is he Indian? Well, maybe, but he claims to be Tibetan, he's Muslim, he's Kashmiri, he's all these things at once, and the state has no way of deciphering which one of those you can pin him down as. His faith is another interesting part of it. You don't often think of Muslims in Tibet, and one of the problems with titling the book that way was people kept saying, do you want people to think your book is about Muslims? Isn't it about Buddhists? And it's like, no, there was a Muslim population in Tibet, and it's kind of important. In Tibet, the Muslims fall into two broad groups. There's the Kaji and the Hui. The Kajis were of Kashmiri ancestry. Most had settled in Tibet around about the 17th century. The Indian position on them is they're Kashmiri. Proof of this is the fact they're Muslim, and therefore they're Indian. The PRC says we can't accept this, and we can't accept this for two reasons. First of all, we're neutral in the Indo-Pakistani dispute over which side Kashmir belongs to, and if we were to say by virtue of being Muslim and therefore Kashmiri, they're Indian, we'd be taking sides, which we absolutely refuse to do. Second, centuries of intermarriage have made these Kashmiri Muslims Tibetan, and therefore Chinese, so they're ours. You're talking about 100 households with a disproportionate importance to the frontier economy. They're mostly engaged in trade. They've made massive fortunes by local standards. It's an important source of taxable income. And some of them are cadres in the administration too. The whole issue is never quite solved, and it seems to have been worked out on a case-by-case basis. But as local officials in Tibet saw it, Indian agents could use Kaji nationalism, if you will, against the PRC. There was a man called Adwani, for example, who was born in Lhasa, and he was apprehended in 1959 and charged as a foreign citizen. The charge, he and other Kajis had schemed with the Indian consulate to mobilize the Tibetan Muslim population, organizing illegal meetings, asking people to create disturbances around government buildings, and circulating pamphlets condemning the revolution. There's a multiplier effect to such actions, of course. One demonstration can get many more people interested in the rebellion, and it's problematic that these people are getting support from Indian officialdom. These ripples amongst the Kaji population affect the other Muslim group, the Hui. The Hui are Chinese, 900 people in all, again important to the local economy. But once they see Kajis, or some Kajis are being given the right to leave, they start demanding the same. By 1962, they are rioting en masse, embarrassing the Foreign Affairs Office. And in November 1962, they actually do so at a banquet and held in front of the Nepali consulate. And local officials detect an Indian hand. They claim they see Indians going to these people and saying, aren't you Kashmiri? Why don't you go register to get papers and go over to a better life the other side of the mountains? Now, this is creating several problems. It's creating a rift between the state and those it governs. It's undermining the state's claim to provide a good home. It's removing taxable income, and it's taking cadres away, people who are supposed to be governing are saying, maybe we're Indian and we want to go. In a very real sense, it's undermining China's claim to legitimate, decent rule. The official response is to declare that the Kaji, well, they're of mixed descent, so maybe they can choose in some cases, but the Hui can't, because they're definitely Chinese. The problem is, you have no way of distinguishing between them. Here's one quote from a frustrated official. Many people claiming they are of Kaji descent are fake, but we have no way of checking. But you don't have any way of checking. You're not going to be able to swear their ancestors who are long dead. The papers could mean anything, and you really don't know. And they decide, once again, on the soft side of counterinsurgency at the local level. We're going to go soft, we're going to be careful, we're going to try to integrate returning individuals. There are some people who go to the subcontinent and say, this isn't really what we expected, we'd like to come back. And while some people might be suspicious of such returnees, some people say, you know what, give them a chance, let them integrate into society, we want things to calm down. That's local authorities. Central authorities in Beijing saw things differently and would eventually stop these movements altogether. And that brings us to the trade. The trade was important because it was where the 5 principles originated. It was also important because the frontier relied on it, not just economically, but in terms of life. Along with the trade went a barter, salt for grain, and cashmere. In Tibet, you can't grow that much to eat. How do you get your grain? You harvest salt from the Great Saline Lakes. You get cashmere, you put it in a sack on your back or on your yaks if you're lucky. You trot down to the markets where you swap it with Indian traders and then you come back. And this has been going on for eons. It had burgeoned over time too, especially under that one country, two systems order we had talked about. There were brief interruptions between 1959 and April 1960 due to an Indian blockade, but it had then resumed, and there were new contracts and a new desire to supervise the trade on the part of officials, which shows you something about how well it's taking off. Nobody wants to supervise something which is insignificant. But it's a trade that's based on freedom of movement. In 1961, the Tibet Foreign Affairs Office reports that Indians are denying necessary goods, and there's suddenly reason to believe that the trade is being linked to the border dispute. In the town of Yadong, a trader stands up and blames China, and there's talk of war. And Indian traders keep threatening Tibetans, saying that war's going to come, that if the border dispute isn't settled, there will be no trade, and nobody will be able to do anything. Such reactions undermine Chinese attempts to strengthen state legitimacy in the borderlands. And a fearful population, especially one that's fearful for its livelihood, is not an easy one to govern. The end of the trade is complicated. Both India and China blame one another, and both are probably correct. The trade agreement was supposed to come up for renewal 8 years down the line. India turned down Chinese proposals for the renewal of the trade agreement on December 15, 1961, and again on April 11, 1962, citing China's violations of the 5 principles, as evidenced by the border dispute. The Chinese response to this was, look, the border dispute and the trade agreement are two entirely different things. You're conflating the two. That's silly. But it gives Chinese officialdom reason to believe that India is exploiting China's dependence on the trade to force a border settlement favorable to India. Agreement's expiration date comes and goes. It suddenly turns out that dismantling a trade agreement isn't as easy as one might think. You might decide the trade is over. The Indian diplomat, it's not that we have rejected the negotiation of a new agreement. We just want to find common ground for it. We welcome words for it. Sin has an interesting character. He merits probably a chapter unto himself if there were more information on him. He had actually been back and forth from China several times himself and had studied Chinese history in Sichuan and had then come up and taken this position in the Indian Foreign Ministry. And there's that sense of history he's drawing on as he's saying, you can't stop movements that have gone on for centuries just like that. It's not something that's doable. Once the agreement's gone, we're still going to be related to one another. We were related to one another before the agreement, for crying out loud. Once the agreement expired, he said, relations between the two countries still exist. And the Chinese diplomat he's talking to says, no, you've already turned it down. Get out in a timely fashion. This decision is made after attempts to get grain from Nepal have failed. Nepal seems to have been going through its own food shortages at the time, and Tibetans bringing grain back from there were stopped at the border and the grain was taken for them. And it's made very clear that Nepal cannot provide grain, and the BRC should make every attempt it can to stop people going there for that purpose. There's no food from India. There's no food from Nepal. You're in the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward. There's still some grain rotting in silos. And it becomes very hard to see any way people out in the Tibetan borderlands could have got food. You get reports from local officials in Ali saying, we're short of grain, please bring it immediately. It's going to be very difficult if not. And the nomads are getting ready to slaughter their animals. Get ready to slaughter your animals en masse unless you've given up hope, basically. And central officialdom says, nothing doing, the trade's done. We've got nothing to say for this. Just deal with it as you see fit. We don't know how many people died as a result, but it's very difficult to see how many could have survived. Why did China do it? Two possible reasons come to mind. The first is credibility. India had asked China to reverse their policy of aggression and respect the boundary between the two countries. Only then could friendship and goodwill be restored, and negotiations for a fresh treaty on trade and intercourse undertaken, and peace in Asia strengthened. You don't want to let India get the idea that it can push you around. You don't want to show you're weak. You don't want to show you can be exploited. If you're into the Indians in something like this, you're going to be in trouble. Show them you're not going to be pushed around. That's one reason. The other reason, dangers of free movement. Free movement creates rebels. Free movement allows rebels to find safe haven, and there is no need to do that. So the trade ends, and that really marks the end of the Order of Five Principles, and to my mind is the most drastic manifestation of that transition from empire light to empire heavy. That imperial rim was sealed. And it's the end of Tibet's apartness too. That idea of one country, two systems is gone. From here on out, what was good for China was going to be good for Tibet. Cautious land reform was launched in '59. Cooperatives were established in both agricultural and nomadic zones. And the transformation of frontier relations was complete. Now the interesting thing is, having touted Afro-Asian unity throughout the 50s, the Chinese had to make sure that they weren't blamed for this falling out between the two biggest champions of that idea. And the justification is interesting. It's the justification of a multi-nation state. In a letter to Indonesia, Zhou Enlai linked the Sino-Indian dispute to Tibet, and then emphasized that the people living in the disputed regions were Tibetans. He says, the longtime inhabitants of this place are Tibetans, or people with intimate blood ties to the Tibetans. For example, the Ba people use Tibetan and follow Lamaism. People here call rivers Chu. They call mountain passes La. Say mountain pass is called Sela. What he's saying is this territory that nobody really knows about, the people who live here are Tibetans. That means it belongs to Tibet. Since Tibetans are Chinese, ipso facto, the place they're living in is Chinese territory. By virtue of being Tibetan, they are Chinese, and that's our claim to this territory. It's an extraordinary claim. It shows you the strengths of being a multi-nation state, if you will. What this does is it fractures third world unity, if such a thing ever existed. There's going to be no more talk of Afro-Asian unity. Burma, Cambodia, Indonesia, Ghana, Ceylon, and Egypt tried to put together a peace plan which goes nowhere in 1963, principally because of Chinese concerns about unilateral troop withdrawal from the disputed areas with India. The third world, when confronted with this, does what the third world always does. It flies in several different directions that are clamoring for several different things. Tanzania hopes that China will change its mind. The Arab League tries to put pressure on China. Nepal tries to play both sides. Pakistan criticizes India for accepting American aid. It's a grand time to be Pakistani right now because you can finally get the Chinese on board with how bad the Indians are. This is the beginning of the Sino-Pakistani friendship. The boundary is fixed between China and Pakistan almost immediately after this. And China goes so far as to say it's okay with Pakistan's membership in the anti-communist pacts of SEATO and CENTO. Huge deal because the Pakistanis have been criticized for this vociferously throughout the 50s. But from here on out, Pakistan can be a voice of reason in these anti-communist pacts, advocating for its good friend China, not something the Chinese had thought of before. The relationship with Nepal strengthens to the point where the two talk about joint action against Tibetans. What you're seeing is the replacement of that idea of five principles, of anti-imperial countries conducting foreign policy the way anti-imperial countries should, by a colder and colder way of conducting foreign relations. balance of power politics. Your enemy's enemy is your friend. That really is the end of this grand dream. So what does it all mean? For Cold War historians, I would suggest it means that geography is something we should take more seriously, that the fourth world and non-state actors are something we should take more seriously. There are other frontiers and other territories where these kinds of movements occurred that I think have yet to make their way into the history books. For historians of empire, I think it means that there are chapters yet to be written. Typically, we tend to see decolonization as being the narrative of the latter part of the 20th century, but maybe there was some recolonization as well that we should be paying attention to. And of course, this pretty much gives us Asian geopolitics as we know them today, especially in China's borders with South Asia. So to understand Cold War history, I would argue, to understand imperial history, and to understand contemporary international relations, you really have to know a bit about the Muslims and the traders, the nomads and the spies, who ranged across the Tibetan borderlands a long, long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And now we move to our question and answer discussion period. If you would wait for the microphone before you start speaking, and if you could identify yourself as you speak, we would appreciate it. We'll start us off.
Let me perhaps sort of chime in, since you're here at the Cold War International History Project, talk a little bit about doing research. You mentioned the problematic Chinese archives, but I know you've been to Tibet and other interesting places to do research. Talk a little bit about what it was like to do that sort of research.
So, do you want me to talk about the FBRC too?
Sure.
So all these documents got reclassified about a year after I finished my research, which was unfortunate in many different ways, but they got reclassified for various theories that are floating around, but one of them has to do, this is just an interesting side note, with a document that made its way out that talked about the Senkaku Islands as opposed to the Diaoyu Islands. This was a Chinese document that a Japanese journalist found and promptly published in a Japanese newspaper. Now, if you actually look at the offending document, it doesn't say the Senkaku Islands belong to Japan. It's one of those confessions of ignorance I was talking about. The actual language is to the effect of, these so-called Senkaku Islands might be part of our Taiwan. Maybe we want to investigate, we're not sure. Which shows you how far we've come from Mao's China to Xi Jinping's, but that's a separate story. Some of those documents we've got here, right? So large stashes of the documents I had have been deposited here for people to use if they wish. Access to Chinese provincial archives is hit and miss for this period, but it's surprising how lucky you can get. I had extraordinary luck in the Chongqing Municipal Archives, partly because there wasn't a system for declassification. It depended on the whims of the archivist. So if you got her in a good mood, she'd give you all sorts of stuff, including on combat rebellions and so forth. So I would go back there. Taiwan has an extraordinary set of archives. Not organized and cataloged, interestingly enough, as well as the BRC ones are, but very full and very easily accessible. And Nepal and Tibet I did interviews, and I did interviews in Urdu. So Britain was another great place to go, because they kept getting reports from people who stayed in South Asia much longer than you would think.
Have no local archives in Lhasa or?
Local archives in Lhasa are closed, me at least.
Yeah. All right. Good. Questions, comments?
Could you, for someone who knows yourself? Steve Lipson. For someone who knows nothing of the background, could you clarify India's position about these religious issues? Like, given the conflicts with Pakistan and in Kashmir, I'm surprised that India was encouraging Muslims to come to, or like the Chinese Muslims to come to move to India.
Yeah. Well, it's because India doesn't see itself as a religious country at this point. The whole argument is we're a secular country, and that Pakistan nonsense about needing a separate homeland for Muslims is completely wrong. it's partly sentimental too. Nehru's very attached to the idea of Kashmir as part of India, and it shows through in his letters remarkably. So when I talk about the Chinese saying, we can give and take, exchange here or there, that's a much colder way of doing it than this passionate, this is my land and I will not give it up. But encouraging the Muslims to come was very simply the reasonable assumption that Muslims could find a homeland in India too. And just because they were Muslim didn't make them automatically Pakistani or suspect at the time.
Sorry, who's this?
Sure.
Dane Kennedy. Actually, two questions. One has to do with the Dalai Lama, who drops out of your story fairly early. And I'm just curious, he flees to India. Subsequently, of course, in recent decades, there's been this movement for sort of an independent Tibet connected with the Dalai Lama. Does that to examine? The other question has to do with the famine that you addressed right at the end. Do you have any sense that this is the deliberate strategy on the part of the Chinese? And if so, is it connected in any way with sort of what they're doing in China itself?
Okay. The Dalai Lama did drop out of the story because he seemed to be dropping out of the archives too, which was interesting. I didn't think about that all that much, but in terms of the problems China was facing, this one guy in India isn't all that big a deal. I mean, he's a figurehead, obviously, for a lot of things, and people rally around the symbolism of it. But on a day-to-day basis, you're more concerned about that guy trafficking guns. And this might have been part of my own predilections, too. I just found them inherently more interesting than the Dalai Lama's story. But it was justified, I think, by the archival record, which showed them obsessing about this much more than the Dalai Lama. The famine was interesting at several levels. One, because obviously I could barely find anything about it. It was clear that something had happened. There were reports of people not being happy and slaughtering their animals, and officials saying, we have no way of getting grain beyond this. Tell us something. The politics of it, there is the accusation that this was deliberate Chinese genocide in Tibet. That, on the evidence, seems to me to be untrue. It seems to have been more of a, you are the collateral damage, if you will, of our need to secure our frontier and show the Indians who's boss. And in that respect, too, it's different from what happens in China, and that famine's ended a little earlier, of course. That was bad planning, which is a poorly understated way of putting it, but in essence, that's what it was. It was criminally bad. Refusal to stare reality in the eye. But here it seems to have been deliberate to the extent of this is how geopolitics go, but not deliberate in that this way we will kill off all Tibetans.
All right, there in the back.
Susie Jakes from the Asia Society. You mentioned early in the talk that there were some uprisings in the Tibetan parts of China proper that may or may not have been funded by the U.S. Where's the U.S. in the rest of the story? I mean, was China worried about the U.S.'s relationship with India?
Yeah. So the uprisings in the early 50s in the Kham areas, some of them did get support from the US, and one of the most fun moments I had researching the book was interviewing Ken Knaus, who was at a conference we had here, who had worked with the Tibetans, and some fantastic stories to tell about that. Again, over there, the interesting thing is you get people working with Tibetans in Sichuan saying fairly early on, you need to give them more of a stake. This reform thing isn't going the way it should. It's going to create a rebellion. We have to do something about this. Not alluding to the US, interestingly enough. That's just, we're creating the conditions that'll make them go haywire. At this time of the story, the US is there, but not to the extent one would think. They're much more worried about India. They're worried about the US possibly collaborating with India, but the assumption is that India is behind it all, or that the Tibetans are behind it all. There are worries about what the US might do at the UN. especially because the CIA helped find the international lawyer who was going to help the Tibetans with their claim for statehood. But it's part of the story, not the center, which is kind of interesting. You would think it would loom much more in terms of charges of American imperialism and so forth, but it really doesn't.
Right, back there.
I'm Warren Smith, Radio Free Asia. I'm a Tibetan historian and a graduate of Fletcher School. I've written several books on Tibetan history. I have just a couple of comments. A couple of interesting facts of history. It wasn't Mao who promised self-determination to Tibet. That was in 1935. It's in the first Chinese Communist Constitution. Mao wasn't actually in charge of the Chinese Communist Party at that time. The people in charge were trained by Moscow. They were Comintern-trained Chinese. So they offered self-determination to Tibet and Mongolia and Manchuria and even Xinjiang, which they said could either return to, could become part of the People's Republic of China, or it could return to the Soviet Union, which shows you some of the influence of the Soviets at this time. The other thing is about Panchshila, or the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence in 1954. You seem to present that as an idealistic Chinese foreign policy about non-interference. Actually, it wasn't so much about China promising not to interfere in other countries. It was demanding that other countries not interfere in China, particularly in Tibet. And India, at that time, was the only country that might do that, that might challenge Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. So that by getting this agreement with India, China then eliminated any challenges to its sovereignty over Tibet.
2 reactions. On Mao, he's not in charge, but he does make a speech about it, interestingly, as does Zhou in the 30s. And the speech isn't a promise, interestingly enough. It's the holding out of this possibility. And I wonder if one of the reasons it changes, and this was just triggered by your remark, is being in charge and being at the second tier of command are 2 different things. Maybe there's something about growing up that forces you to renege on ideas of time past.
I think it's just a mistake to attribute it to say that Mao promised self-determination to Tibet.
Well, he didn't promise anything.
Well, Mao can sort of basically continue the policy up until the mid-40s when they finally changed it. I mean, it just didn't come up again.
The reason I invoked Mao, of course, was because he was in charge when it could have happened, right? Realistically, if this was going to happen, it would have been 49 to circa 51, you'd have given them self-determination. And the fact that you have this guy who talked about self-determination in actually very moving terms in the 30s, who's now in a position to do something about it, where he wasn't once upon a time, and who just backs away from it. And I don't think, we can go back and forth here, but I don't think he was making it up either. I think he really meant it at the time.
That was also Soviet policy, deriving from Stalin, was to promise self-determination to nationalities. It was a very cynical policy that didn't really mean...
I have a hard time squaring that with the tone of the speech, though, and I have a hard time squaring that with the way... Mao Zedong seemed to think at the time. I really think he meant it when he said it, but that's just guessing.
Well, as I say, it's just an interesting...
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, something interesting is that Chiang Kai-shek promised self-determination.
He did. And he went...
1945.
Well, he's actually promising that throughout the story, too. This is the part I didn't talk about in the book, but he's telling the Tibetans, we're going to take over and then we'll grant you self-determination, which, of course, they have a very hard time believing. He also scuppers talk of Tibetan statehood at an Afro-Asian civil society conference, or his representatives do, rather, and he's very proud of it, but that makes it all the harder for the Tibetans to trust him this more. But I'd be fascinated if someone, and I don't know how this would be done, could track the changes in the way Mao thought. If you could actually pinpoint the reasons for. In the 30s you were talking about this, and you were talking about it in ways that seem not Soviet-inspired, but genuine. You know, maybe you're an extraordinarily good faker, but in this case I don't think so. What changed? Is there some sort of internal political process? Is it just growing up? I don't know. On Panchshila, I think it's both. I think it's a way of saying other countries won't invade China. It's also coming up because the Indians are saying these borders are unclear. And it's a way of reassurance. And there's a lot of reassurance to India over and over again. We're not going to invade you. We're not that kind of country. Which Nehru accepts, and many people in his cabinet say, you're an idiot for doing this. But he does accept it. And Panchal is invoked by way of saying, look, we signed this agreement, it's not going to happen. So I think that actually cuts both ways.
On this side of the table, gentleman right here in the middle.
My name is Matt Herbert. I'm a PhD student actually at the Fletcher School. And excellent job, I think, in laying out kind of this transition from border management to border security as part of PRC. I'm curious to what degree you looked at other borders and whether these models that were developed in Tibet were implemented elsewhere, or whether models that were developed elsewhere were employed during kind of this crisis period in Tibet. So to what degree is this an indicator of a shift in overall border strategy for China?
This is one of the 2 bits of the book that I regret having got away. Because there was information on other borders in the FMPRC. Tibet's the first one where you see this kind of transition, but it happens later in Xinjiang. It happens in a handful of other places you can think of. And one of the things I wish I had done, I don't know if I could have reasonably done this, but I wish I had done it, was to have got the information for all the other borders and written a bigger book about people crossing frontiers in general and Chinese foreign policy changing. You do see a similar hardening, as I mentioned, in Xinjiang with the Sino-Soviet conflict erupting, but the most interesting parallels to me are twofold. First of all, the Empire Light model, which Deng draws on when he's doing the work on Hong Kong, and which is touted as a model for Taiwan today. It's an interesting study in the limits of how it can work. It depends on the intentions of the central power, and those can change fairly quickly. But the other interesting place to me is, I'm not sure this holds exactly, but the dispute with Japan. That whole sea corridor, if you think about it, was a place exactly like the ones we've been talking about, cosmopolitan with people from all sorts of different places milling around. It's extraordinary when you look at documents in Taiwan, how even what you would think of as the most heavily policed Cold War frontier, Cold War Japan, is astonishingly porous. You have people from Indonesia and Malaysia stopping in at Hong Kong, Taiwan, points along the Chinese mainland coast, then to Japan and back again. That Empire Light model existed, and I'd say that the rhetoric out of the Chinese side, both before the eventual establishment of diplomatic relations with Japan and after, mirrored pretty much what you would see with countries over Tibet. We can agree to disagree about where the borders are, we can agree to disagree about where these